I never thought I would become one of those people who believe in strange happenings or supernatural forces. But then again, I had never lived in an apartment like this. That I had recently moved into a small, seemingly ordinary building on the outskirts of the city. It was an old structure, but well maintained, with faded wallpaper, squeaky floors, and that peculiar smell of old wood and dust. The kind of place that felt both familiar and alien at the same time. The rent was affordable, which was a rarity in the city, so I didn't hesitate when I found it. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Lowry, seemed friendly enough but distant. He was always polite, though he would never meet my eyes directly. He would often glance at his watch, as if in a hurry, before quickly walking away. When I first moved in, he gave me a set of rules for the building. At first, I dismissed them as just standard apartment guidelines. But now, looking back, I realize how wrong I was. The first rule was simple enough: do not knock on any doors unless you are invited. It seemed strange at first, but I thought perhaps it was just one of those quirks of old buildings where tenants like to keep to themselves. However, after a few days, I started to notice something odd. The other tenants were different. They never left their apartments, and whenever I passed by their doors, I could feel their presence, but there was no sound. No footsteps, no talking. Just a heavy silence that hung in the air. One evening, I was coming home after work, and I noticed something unsettling. There was a knock on the door of the apartment across the hall from mine, a place I had never seen anyone enter or leave. Curious, I stood in front of my door, unsure of what to do. The knock was soft at first, like the tapping of a finger, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it was a series of sharp, frantic raps. I looked down the hallway, but no one was there. Suddenly, the door of the apartment across the hall creaked open, and a figure stepped out. He was tall, thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. He didn't say a word but just stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a sound, he disappeared back into his apartment, and the door slowly closed behind him. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The second rule was more specific: never speak to the tenants in the hallway. It seemed odd at first, but after the incident with the man across the hall, I decided to follow it. I never saw anyone else in the hallway anyway, so it didn't seem difficult. But then one night, I was leaving my apartment when I saw a woman standing at the far end of the hallway, just outside her door. She had long, dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders, and she was dressed in a long, flowing white gown. She looked like she belonged in another time, as though she had stepped out of a dream. She smiled at me and called my name. "You're new here, aren't you?" I froze, unsure of how she knew my name. I had never spoken to her before. "Yes," I managed to reply, my voice shaky. "I just moved in." Her smile widened. "I've been here a long time. You should be careful. The building is not what it seems." I felt a chill run down my spine. Before I could say anything more, she turned and disappeared into her apartment without another word. The third rule was the most disturbing: do not open the door if someone knocks after midnight. At first, I thought it was just a precautionary measure. Maybe the building had a history of strange occurrences at night. But after a few weeks, I began to notice something strange. The knocks, they always came just after midnight, soft and gentle at first, as if someone was tapping on my door with a finger. But then, it would escalate. The knocks became louder, almost desperate, as if someone was pleading to be let in. I could hear the muffled voice on the other side, calling my name. "Let me in, please, let me in." It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple voices, all layered together, each one different, yet the same. They spoke in unison, their tones filled with desperation and anguish. That I never opened the door. I had learned my lesson. The fourth rule was the most cryptic: do not leave the building after dusk. It was one rule I didn't fully understand until one evening, when I ignored it. That I had been feeling restless. The atmosphere in the building had started to feel heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. So, I decided to take a walk, despite the rule. I stepped out into the courtyard and felt the cold night air on my skin, but as I walked further into the darkness, something strange happened. The courtyard seemed to stretch out further than I remembered. The buildings around me seemed to shift, like they were moving just out of sight. I turned back, but the entrance to the building was no longer where I had left it. The door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of brick that I was trapped. That I began to hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, but no one was there. The silence was deafening. The further I walked, the more the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down on me, suffocating me. Eventually, I found myself back at the door, but when I tried to enter, the door wouldn't open. I knocked, but no one answered. I was stuck outside, alone in the dark, with only the whispering wind and the distant sound of knocking to keep me company. The last rule was the most terrifying of all: never try to leave the building once you've entered. I should have known. I should have understood. But I was too late. The longer I stayed in the building, the more I became aware of the truth. The building wasn't just old, it was alive. It fed on the fear of its inhabitants, trapping them in an endless cycle of rules and rituals. Every time I followed a rule, I felt myself sinking deeper into its grasp. Every time I broke one, I felt the consequences: that I was no longer just a tenant. I was part of it.